Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk a little bit about the 2022 Survivor Series live from Boston, Massachusetts. The return to big screen, the big screen, anyway. The big shows, pay-per-view of War Games. War Games, of course, the traditional multi-man uh, match inside of a steel cage. Usually it's double ring, but this war game with a top on it. But this War Games WWE's version a little bit different, but still basically the same concept. It was the Bloodline competing against Sheamus and his team, which had Kevin Owens on it, the returning Kevin Owens, and uh, basically the combination of these two events. Survivor Series, of course, we talked about it a lot on this channel, the history of the Survivor Series and how Vince McMahon manipulated in 1987 to uh, basically outmaneuver Jim Crockett Promotions and Starcade. And that was a multi man style pay per view, at least up until 1992. Every match on the Survivor Series was teams of five strive to survive. That was the original tagline for the original Survivor Series. And up until 1992, every match was that. But long story short, Bloodline won the event. They're still the ones. They're still basically on fire. When it comes to their winning streak, they're the most popular thing in the company right now. Especially Sami Zayn, Sami Zayn and Jey Uso, their interactions. The honorary Us, Sami Zayn, carrying his team to victory. But what I really wanted to, and it was a successful night for Rhea Ripley and her team. Scoring the victory, and also for Bianca Belair's team. And Seth Rollins was um, also successful last night. But really, what I really wanted to touch on was the history, a little bit of War Games. What is War Games? Well, War Games was a specialty match devised in the early 1980s. I mean, the late 1980s, 1987 to be exact, by the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, based on the 1983 movie Mad Max. The same exact movie where Ole Anderson got his inspiration for the Road Warriors characters, and the same exact movie where um, Demolition got their gimmick from. Um, Sid worked for a while as Lord Humongous, one of the characters from there. So wrestling in general has drawn a lot on this particular movie for years. It doesn't actually come from the actual movie. There's an actual movie where there is War Games, but it comes from the Thunderdome, the Thunderdome, Terradome type fight to the end, apocalyptic type um, battle. And Dusty Rhodes had this idea for two rings, an enclosed cage, and different teams. Because what was happening in the lead up to that, of course, in 1985, the Four Horsemen formed. Originally, it was Ole Anderson, Tully Blanchard, Arn Anderson, and Ric Flair. Ric Flair comes into Jim Crockett Promotions from the AWA as a cousin of the Andersons, and then he proceeds to team with first Ole and Gene Anderson, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, and then Ole and Arn Anderson when Arn Anderson comes in the mid '80s from Mid South. So Around this time, they start to work together with J.J. Dillon. Also, J.J. Dillon is the manager of Tully Blanchard, who came in from his father's promotion, Southwest Championship Wrestling. And Dusty Rhodes has this idea that they will all form a faction together, like a sort of gang type mentality. And they name themselves after the four horsemen of the apocalypse from the book of Revelations. So Arn Anderson sometimes tells a story that it happened by accident. He's just doing his promo, and all of a sudden he says, "These men here are like the four horsemen of the apocalypse." And then Tony Schiavone, who's the announcer for Jim Crockett Promotions, tells him, "Well, you just happen upon, to call yourself the four horsemen." But according to other sources, it was Dusty Rhodes that devised this idea for the Four Horsemen. They attack him in 1985. It looks like they're going to help him out against the Russians at that time. Ivan Nikita Koloff and Crusher Khrushchev, who was played by Barry Darso, who was basically a Russian sympathizer, an American who defected over to the Soviet Union side. Well, they don't, and they lock him into the cage and they break his leg, and that is the beginning of the feud between Dusty Rhodes and his partner Magnum TA and the Four Horsemen. Now, back and forth from 1985 to 1987, the Horsemen are feuding with Magnum TA and with Dusty Rhodes, and also with the Road Warriors, who who made their triumphant return back to Jim Crockett Promotions in the middle of '85 after things didn't things didn't go over smoothly with the AWA. They had some contract disputes with the AWA. They were at Super Clash, the first Super Clash, where they wrestled against um, the Fabulous Freebirds, and from there they had disputes. They won the tag team belts um, at one point from Baron von Raschke. Um, I mean, not Baron von Raschke, Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher, but they had some disputes with Vern Gagne's contract disputes. He didn't want to give him a contract, so they headed over to the NWA, where they found themselves, of course, feuding with the Four Horsemen. At this point was Tully and Arn, because in the middle of 1985, um, Ole Anderson gets kicked out of the Four Horsemen. They turn him babyface. They say it's because he wants to go to his son's wrestling meets, and he's not abiding by Four Horsemen rules. And they move him out and they put in Lex Luger. And Lex Luger is now the newest member of the Four Horsemen. Luger, of course, coming over from Florida Championship Wrestling. He was one of their newest sensations. Of course, Dusty Rhodes, who's booking Jim Crockett Promotions, was a former booker and former star in Florida Championship. Excuse me, not Florida Championship Wrestling. Championship Wrestling from Florida. There's a distinction. Of course, FCW was the developmental brand for WWE, but uh, he he gets him from. He comes over from Florida Championship Wrestling. Lex Luger. He had some problems there. Their famous incident where Bruiser Brody is not selling for him, and it is what it is. But they bring him in as the newest member of the Four Horsemen in the middle of like in the beginning of like 1987. They bring him in, and also they turn Nikita Koloff to a babyface. There was the accident with Magnum TA, in which Magnum was injured in his motorcycle accident. He was supposed to be the next big thing for Jim Crockett, but he was injured, so they needed another top babyface. So during this time, during the late 80s, in the real world, there was something called détente, a cooling off period during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So they figured, hey, turning a former Russian guy, a former Russian communist, whose finishing move is the hammer and sickle into a babyface would be a good PR move. So they decide to turn Nikita Koloff into a babyface, and he starts teaming with Dusty Rhodes as the superpowers. So all of this is happening all at once, and Dusty finally decides to create the super match in which the Four Horsemen will take on Nikita Koloff and the Road Warriors. And it wasn't initially aired on TV, it was just a house show match, but they did this around the horn. And like the whole United States was as part of the Great American Bash Tour, and this was 1987. From there, in 1988, they did the exact same match, but they turned Lex Luger into a babyface, and instead they had Barry Windham as the Four Horsemen. Then, of course, in 1989, Dusty Rhodes leaves for the WWF. There's that incident where he's having the feud with now a heel Road Warriors, in which Ted Turner, Turner Broadcasting TBS, tells him not to blade, and he does. He does blade. Not only does he blade, but they show one of the Road Warriors driving their spike into his eye, so he gets in trouble for that, and he's fired from Jim Crack Promotions, and he goes to the WWF, and he's there till 1991. Now, during this time in 1991, they don't have from 89 to 91, they don't have the War Games match. When Dusty's not there, they don't have it. Only, I guess, didn't like the concept, so they didn't do it. But Wrestle War 91, Dusty Rhodes comes back, and they have again the War Games match, this time with Sid as a Four Horseman, and they're competing against Brian Pillman and Sting's team. And this is the famous one where Sid almost breaks Brian Pillman's neck and nearly cripples Flying Brian Pillman. Then in 1992, again, Wrestle War, they have it again with the Dangerous Alliance. Ric Flair is out of the company. He loses the belt to Sting at the Great American Bash in 1990. Then he wins it back because of Sting's injury. Then he leaves the company. We talked about it before, his disputes with Jim Herd, and he goes to the WWF. So while he's gone in the WWF, they don't have they have the War Games match, but they don't have the Four Horsemen to be that constant in the War Games. So Dusty Rhodes had this idea to create a new faction, sort of like the Four Horsemen, but centered around ravishing Rick Rude. He comes in as the Halloween Phantom at Halloween Havoc 1990, and he starts the team with Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Stunning Steve Austin, and to create this faction known as the Dangerous Alliance. And it was in 1992 Wrestle War, one of the greatest War Games matches that they've ever had, I say. Then in 93, that was the famous 93, they create a new pay-per-view event, Fall Brawl, and that's when War Games become synonymous with this pay-per-view, Fall Brawl. And in this one, they don't have a set faction running wild. They do have the Four Horsemen because the Four Horsemen reformed as Slamboree 93, but they were baby faces, so they don't have a set faction going into Fall Brawl 93, but they do have Vader, Sid, and Harlem Heat, all people, I guess, managed by Colonel Bob Parker and Harley Race. Then in 1994, what do? They start to have the Colonel Parker Stud Stable, which is Arn Anderson, Terry Funk, who returned at Slamboree 94, and uh, Arn Anderson going against, and Ming, who's the bodyguard, going against um, the Nasty Boys, Dusty Rhodes and Dustin Rhodes, teaming with Dusty Rhodes and Dustin Rhodes. This is the famous angle where Dusty Rhodes, reunites with his son. He saves him from Ming and the Stud Stable, and also the famous match where the stipulation was if the baby faces win, they get 5 minutes alone with the manager, Colonel Rob Parker, and apparently, allegedly, um, Colonel Rob Parker went to the bathroom on himself in this match, because he was wearing white pants, and you know, people saw number two stains, as he was leaving the ring. But we don't know if it's true. Of course, Ron Fuller himself denies this. But some of the background for this storyline, a lot of people didn't like it, but I enjoyed it. They did it all throughout the year. It basically started with the feud between Dustin Rhodes and Colonel Rob Parker. Went on from there to the bunkhouse match at Spring Stampede '94, and then went on from there to include his father, and then the Nasty Boys turned babyface, and they themselves teamed with Dusty and Dustin. But this was one of the most um, a landmark pay per view in WCW at this point, because this was the last WCW pay per view for a long while that did not have a feature match with Hulk Hogan. Um, Hulk Hogan had come in at Bash at the Beach 1994, and he was basically dominating the main event scene, especially after he won the heavyweight title from Ric Flair at that same event. So, um, to have the pay per view centered around Dustin and Dusty was kind of cool. That okay, um, you don't have to feature Hulk Hogan in every single event just because he's now your main star. And Ming was made to look like something credible. Ming, then in 1995, Ming would go on to be part of the team of the Dungeon of Doom. So what I said in 1994 about Hogan wasn't true in 1995. In 1995, he had his first War Games match. It was him, Sting, Macho Man, and a returning Lex Luger. It was supposed to be Vader, but Vader, of course, had that altercation with Paul Orndorff, where Paul Orndorff allegedly knocked him out, and he was fired. He was fired. He was supposed to go in on the babyface team, and he was let go. But at the same time, Luger was coming over from back over from the WWF. This was the one that included Kamala, included the Zodiac Man, the Zodiac, which is Brutus Beefcake. Also included Avalanche, who was now known as the Shark, John Tenta, and the Giant that makes his in-ring debut at the end of the match by breaking Hulk Hogan's neck. Again, with this match, the stipulation was that if he won, you got 5 minutes alone with Kevin Sullivan. Of course, the babyfaces did win, but the Giant came in, so Hogan didn't get that 5 minutes alone. Then in '96, of course, everything that went down, the Dungeon of Doom was eventually phased out. Hulk Hogan turned a heel at Bash at the Beach, formed the NWO. So the NWO Fall Brawl '96, that War Games was very unique because here you had the two baby faces that started the whole thing, basically, in Luger and Sting, especially Luger. He was in the first one, and he was teaming up with his old Four Horsemen mates in Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, because the whole storyline was the main baby faces of WCW, Luger and Sting, had to get together and team with the main heels of WCW Flair and Arn Anderson. And there was this whole thing where Sting turned NWO because they did a Nitro where Sting attacked the WCW wrestlers, and they said, "Oh well, Sting is now the newest member of the NWO." Right? It turned out not to be that. It was a fake Sting. It was Jeff Farmer, who was formerly Cobra, pretending to be Sting. Sting, the real Sting, comes out, beats up the NWO, and then he leaves. And the next night on Nitro, he says, um, "The only thing that's for sure about Sting is nothing's for sure." And he's just distraught that his friends and people that have known him for years, even his adversaries and Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, that they don't trust him. And he then proceeds to go into the rafters for a year and have his big build up match with Hulk Hogan that ended in Starrcade '97. From that point on in '97, we go into now the Horsemen are baby faces, the full baby faces. The tide has turned. Um, Arn Anderson retires. He does his big retirement speech. My spot, in which he gives his spot to Kurt Hennig, who has now come over from the WWF, the newest member of the Four Horsemen, the NWO guys, led by Kevin Nash. It's Kevin Nash, Six, Conan, Buff Bagwell, um, and Buff Bagwell um, representing the NWO, and the Horsemen representing WCW. But it was a swerve. Kurt Hennig turns to the NWO and slams the door in Ric Flair's face. A lot of people don't like this one because the Horsemen never got their retribution. Even when they came back later on in 1998, with Dean Malenko as a member of the Horsemen, they never got their retribution. They never got they never got their revenge on the NWO. And plus, people don't like this one because it was filled with guys like Buff Bagwell and Conan and Six, guys that really weren't real main eventers in people's minds. No Hulk Hogan, no Roddy Piper, no people like that. But by 1998, now 1998 was something different because remember, Kevin Nash had turned to a babyface, Macho Man had turned to a babyface, and they created their splinter off faction of the NWO Red and Black, splitting away from Hulk Hogan's NWO Hollywood Black and White. So going into Fall Brawl 1998, this was the main storyline. It was Kevin Nash, Sting, and Lex Luger. Lex Luger and Sting had joined now the NWO, and they were going against Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, and Stevie Ray on the NWO Hollywood side, and the Ultimate Warrior, who returned weeks earlier on Nitro, teaming up with DDP and Roddy Piper representing the WCW side. Now, Eric Bischoff, when he took over WCW, he didn't really like the War Games concept, so he wanted to tweak it a little bit. And the idea was that whoever makes a pinfall, the pinfall's counted in this one. In the usual War Games, pinfalls didn't count. It was once every member of each team was in, it was submit or surrender. And the only way you could win is if the opposition submitted, because it was the match beyond. That was the tagline for War Games. But in this one, you could score a pinfall, and DDP ultimately does score a pinfall, going on to Halloween Havoc 1998 and wrestling Goldberg for the #1 contendership. But a lot of people didn't like this one, and this one 1998 kind of marked the end of War Games. They had another one that Russo put on. That's where Russo got speared out of the cage by Goldberg and he got concussed. But that really wasn't War Games. So that was basically the end of War Games. Going back, I want to correct something that I said earlier in the video. I said in 1989 they didn't do War Games. After Dusty left, they in fact did do War Games in 1989. it was the Fabulous Freebirds were actually in a War Games match. Them and Dr. Death Steve Williams taking on the Midnight Express and the Road Warriors um, at the Great American Bash in 1989. That was, of course, 1989. How could I forget that? 1989's Great American Bash was considered one of the greatest wrestling pay-per-views of all time. That, of course, it had Lex Luger versus Ricky Steamboat as well, and had Terry Funk versus Flair. But like I said, by the time WWE bought WCW in 2001, they retired the War Games concept. But they brought it back for this Survivor Series, and I do believe that they will continue to do War Games. You know, I always enjoyed War Games. My first pay per view that I ever watched from WCW, which was Fall Brawl '93, the one I said with the Shockmaster and stuff. You know, when he debuted, he was teaming with Sting and the British Bulldog and Dustin Rhodes. Everybody knows it's the Shockmaster, and then he trips over his own feet and falls. Fred Outman, aka Typhoon. That was the first WCW pay per view I ever watched, and I love the War Games concept. I was used to watching cage matches in WWE where they used the big blue. Hey Lisa, what's going on? Where they used the big blue steel cage bars, and I never really liked that. I never really enjoyed it. Um, I when I saw WCW's version of the cage, which became the prototype for the Hell in a Cell matches, which was more like a real cage, more like a real fence. I like that. And War Games was always very brutal. War Games always had blood in it. War Games always was like a gang fight, multiple wrestlers flying around, and the submit a surrender concept of the match beyond was always very intriguing. And when WWE didn't bring it back after 2001, I'm like, oh wow, you know what I mean? That sucks. You know what I mean? Because if the Royal Rumble is the best concept that WWE ever had to offer, then War Games was the best gimmick concept that WCW, Jim Crockett Promotions, the NWA, and Dusty Rhodes ever came up with. You know what I mean? So I'm like, why didn't they ever bring it back? They brought it back for NXT and some minor shows like that a couple of years ago. But I always said, well, would it ended the invasion angle, the war between WCW and the WWE that they later did in 2001 after they brought um, the WCW wrestlers over. It would have been cool if that angle ended in a War Games match, because WCW wrestlers could have been like, um, you know what advantage we got over the WWE wrestlers? We got War Games. You don't know how to compete in War Games. You never been in War Games, and they could have had the whole feud culminate in a War Games match. But I don't know, Vince McMahon, he didn't like War Games or something. You know, he never wanted to bring it over. But now Triple H is in charge of WWE, or allegedly, as Big Dog says, you know, now they can have War Games. You know what I mean? So, but one thing I didn't like, though, honestly, with this War Games was that they had the cage, but no roof on it. The roof cage gave it the special look, you know, in the double ring. No roof cage and no double ring. And that, to me, then it's not War Games. You know, if you could have pinfalls, if you don't have the double ring and you don't have the roof on the cage, then it ain't War Games. It ain't the tradition of War Games. There are certain traditions with certain gimmick matches that you have to abide by. Otherwise, they're not the same kind of gimmick match that we've come to all love and expect. They tweaked it a little bit, and I didn't like the tweaks. I don't like the changes. I didn't like them when WCW did them, and I don't like them here when WWE has done it. But like Dusty Rhodes said in the War Games DVD, unfortunately, War Games became such a successful concept that people bastardized it, just like they did with the Four Horsemen themselves. So many different versions of the Four Horsemen, and the concept got watered down, just like with the NWO, just like with a lot of stuff. You can't always, you got to keep it special, and you got to keep it as fans remember it, because people are creatures of habit to begin with, but wrestling fans are really, for real, creatures of habit. We we come to expect certain things. We come to expect certain traditions, certain things, and laws and rules that we abide by, that we come to expect as fans. And when somebody messes with that, messes with the formula, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We're like, nah, that's not fucking war games. You know what I mean? So if they're gonna do war games in the future, put the roof on top of the cage and do it that way. But overall, this show was a pretty good show. One of the other things I wanted to mention, Rhea Ripley, um, her storyline with Dominic Mysterio, in which Dominic Mysterio, Dominic Mysterio goes to his dad's house. His dad, Rey Mysterio. Rey Mysterio is sitting there in his mask, right, eating Thanksgiving dinner, and Dominic comes in with Rhea Ripley and starts beating him up. Of course, he's trying to goat his father into a match with him. I like the fact that they're keeping them separated and keeping Ray reluctant to face his son. And they're keeping that to WrestleMania. They don't want to blow their load there. Oftentimes WWE, uh, they get too overly excited and they want to finish too early, and they want to do the match, the big money match at the next pay-per-view after they shot the angle. You gotta wait, you gotta let it simmer. And War Games, the first War Games angle, if you guys, like I was talking about, they built it for 2 years, Dusty Rhodes versus the Horsemen, and they built it and they built it and finally culminated in this. You gotta let stuff simmer, you gotta let stuff wait. Building a wrestling angle is like cooking. You can't take it out of the stove too soon, or else you'll have it raw, and you can't leave it in for too long, or else it gets burnt. You know what I mean? So you gotta let it rock for a while. So keeping Ray and Dominic apart. Of course, I was in support of turning Dominic heel. I wanted to turn him heel back in 2020 when he first started wrestling. You know, you know what I mean? He wasn't good as a babyface. I like him as a heel. Keep him as a heel, and don't turn him until the time is right. People are loving the way Dom is right now. You know what I mean? So keep him like that. But anyway, guys, that's just a little bit of the history of War Games. The War Games match concept, a year by year review. Um, I didn't get everything right, but I did. Oh, one thing I missed. Again, 1989's Great American Bash. I keep missing this. The Fabulous Freebirds team with the Samoan SWAT team, which is the Usos' father, Rikishi, aka Fatu. So, the Samoans, aka the Bloodline, they're very familiar to War Games. I forgot that they were in that match. I haven't seen it in a while. I didn't watch it, when it was transpiring, happening, of course, because I was like 5 years old. But I did later watch it, and I forgot that Fatu, the Usos' father, was in that match. So they have a history, um, the Usos do, and the Samoan family, the Anuahi family, in that match. I oftentimes forget that, and they were managed by Paul Heyman. So how could I, damn, how could I forget that? They're managed by Paul Heyman just like they are right now, and um, they have a history in that match. You oftentimes forget that the Samoans, aka the Anoa'i family, the Rock's family, Yokozuna's family, was in WCW because they have such a history, such a long history with New York. You know what I mean? So you're like, oh shit, they were in WCW at one point. They weren't always in New York, even though they worked very closely with New York. You know what I mean? And they mostly wrestled there. You know what I mean? But they were in WCW at one point. You know what I mean? So yeah, 1989's Great American Bash, skipped over that one. Sometimes forget about that one because Dusty Rhodes wasn't involved with it, but it was one of the greatest. It was one of the greatest ones. It was one of the good ones because it had the Road Warriors in it, and the Road Warriors started the tradition of war games. But what you need for war games too is a strong faction. You know what I mean? You need a strong faction to be dominant, like when the NWO was dominant in the 90s, or the Horsemen, or the Dangerous Alliance. You don't really have a strong, or the Bloodline right now. You don't really have a strong faction dominating. um, the concept isn't going to work. But I'm glad to see War Games is back on the agenda and back in professional wrestling. And it was a good pay per view. It was the day after Thanksgiving, which of course it's a tradition with the Survivor Series, and these two team type events coming together was pretty cool. And we the ones, Bloodline. The tribal chief is still reigning supreme. He's still kicking ass. No sign of anybody, trying to take his crown, trying to take the WWE Championship or the Universal Championship from him. Peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And keep subscribing because for some reason, you guys, you know, subscribers have gone down, but we still continue to dominate on this channel. We might lose battles, but we don't lose wars. Peace.